further ado, let's give Dr. Roan a round of applause.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. It's a thrill to be here, and you know, even though it's basically the same presentation I did before, it's a different audience, and that always makes it exciting for me. So tonight I'm going to talk about a general overview of the how to do family history writing. I want to tell you that what I'm going to talk about tonight really captures a lot of the hands-on workshops that I do. And so if you have any community groups where you'd like me to come and do writing workshops, I do about a dozen different ones. And I love doing them. I do them all for free. And my payment is that I get to listen to lots and lots of good stories. And so please invite me if you have a group that does that. So this photo is of these four darling children from the 1950s on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. And, you know, this sort of reminds me of why I do this work, why you do the work that you do with family history, is that it's all about tracing the lives of the people who start out back looking like that in the 1950s and then look like this in 2014, the tallest of the four. And a little bit about writing that I'm going to give as a preface, and that is, and there's some handouts here, by the way, if people want to grab them. By way of preface, I want to talk a little bit about offering feedback to writers. So one of the things I hope people will do when you leave tonight is go home with some excitement about writing about family history. And I know there are a few people here who write a lot about family history already. Don Godfrey is in the audience, and I know he does that. But it's important when we write that we give people the opportunity to respond to our writing. We benefit immensely from that. And here is a little tool that I will offer. So as you're sharing writing with one another, whether it's family history writing or any other kind of writing, if the first thing you say is, you know what I just heard resonates with me. So for example, a few years ago I was doing a family history writing workshop, hands-on workshop, and someone wrote about butchering chickens. And pretty soon everybody in the room wanted to tell a story about butchering chickens. And some of them lived in the country and some of them lived in the city. And some of them butchered their kitchens in their bathtubs. And it was just a wonderful cacophony of voices talking about butchering chickens. The other thing that's important when we respond to our friends and family members as they write is to mention something that we like. And this is important, I think, rule to live life by. That when we interact with other people, when we look at their work, there's always got to be something that we like, and we should say that. And by the way, I think that's a good strategy for those of us who have jobs and have colleagues. We should be saying the same thing to our colleagues as well. And then the third one, and here I want to spend a little time. So it's important for writers to listen to the real world questions of readers. So, for example, if I were to say to you, my favorite thing to do in growing up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin was to teach 3-day-old calves how to drink milk, would that conjure up any questions for anybody? And by the way, interrupt me as we're going along, make comments, ask questions. So right now, what are some questions that are going through your mind? How do you teach a calf to drink? Okay. Okay, so it resonates with you. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Why? Okay. So the question is, why do you have to teach calves how to drink? They got the mother right there. So those are both good questions. How do you do it? Why do you have to do it? I'm going to put this down for a second because I'm going to demonstrate in a minute, and remind me to pick this up again. So the why. There are several reasons why. One reason why is that when I grew up, I grew up on a dairy farm that produced grade A milk. Grade A milk meant it was produced in a very clean barn, and it was fit for human consumption. There were other farms that had lesser standards for sanitary conditions, and that milk was graded as grade B, not fit for human consumption. It was probably safe, but they couldn't sell it that way. So that would be for animal consumption. So, or cheese, something like that, right. And so that milk from the mother, the first couple days, it's really important for that calf to drink that milk because it's got colostrum in it, and it activates the immune system. But after that, the calf doesn't need that milk, and the colostrum goes away. So that milk becomes too valuable for human consumption to feed to that calf. So instead, you feed that grade B milk. And then how do you get that grade B milk? Well, it's turned into powder. And when we bought it, we bought 100-pound bags of Land O'Lakes powdered milk, and inside were little prizes like jackknives, for example. So we always loved to rip open those bags. And then you mix that powder with some warm water and you put it in a pail. All right, so that's the why. Two reasons why. Oh, well, and the other reason why is that when the calf is born, it is not born with the inclination to drink, but with the inclination to do what? To suckle, right. And so what you do is you build on that inclination to suckle to teach it how to drink. And here's how you do it. You take the calf, you put its neck between your legs so that its head is sticking out this way and its tail is sticking out that way. Because if you don't put the calf's neck between your legs, it'll just wander off. All right? So your legs form a stanchion. And you take these three fingers, you stick these three fingers in the calf's mouth, and what does it do? It suckles. In this hand, you got that pail of that powdered milk mixed with warm water. You put that down, and you take these three fingers in the calf's mouth, and you gently lower your fingers into the milk mixture. The first time you do it, the calf's nose goes down in the milk, and it gets nose up, and it snorts it out, and it's a big mess. But by about the third time you do it, it's learned how to drink. I started doing that when I was 5 years old, which is another question that nobody asked. Why was it your favorite thing to do, Duane? Okay. And that's why, because at 5 years old, I got to teach a calf how to drink milk. That was pretty cool. So the message there is that learning how to write, whether it's writing about family or writing about whatever else, is learning how to meet the needs of an audience. So if I said to my two brothers, Ronald and Terry, my favorite thing to do when we were growing up on the dairy farm was teaching 3-day-old calves how to drink milk, that's all I need to say. All the images come flooding back to them. But for people who didn't have that experience, I need, as a writer, need to know that I need to fill in those gaps. And the best thing that readers can do is just ask questions. Oh, you said your grandma wore a red scarf. How big was the scarf? What shade of red was it? Did it have any designs on it? Things like that. Okay. Questions. Oh, and then the fourth one, suggestions. If readers do a good job with the questions, suggestions are unnecessary. All right. The other thing I want to say as sort of a preface to all of this is that writing is a process, and you all know that at some level. But it becomes a little more complicated than that, and I'm getting now into how we teach writing in the United States in colleges and universities, and to some extent in public schools as well. And that is, we ask students to engage in invention, that is, generating ideas before they do anything else. So it might be just brainstorming, jotting down ideas. Don't worry about sentence structure. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about any of that stuff. The only thing that matters at this point is getting ideas down on paper. And then I do those ideas, and I've generated some ideas about my great-grandma, some things that I've heard, but now that raises some questions for me. All right, so I know this about great-grandma, but that makes me think about this other thing that I don't know about her. Now's the opportunity for me to do the research. Now, a lot of people in this room have done all the research. You've done all the family history, and it's there. You might have to go look it up again in your files, but you've got it there. And then we do something, drafting. Drafting means turning it into something that looks, in structure at least, like a final product. And by the way, in between each of these things, it's really important to give ourselves some time away from the task. You know, if you have any family members who are in college now, and they tell you, I've got a paper due next week, your first question is, I hope you started it last week at least, okay? Because if you do this all right at the last minute, it's not going to be very good quality. And it doesn't matter who it is. I've been writing for 58 years now. I've been teaching writing since the 1970s, and I've published. Come on in and join us, please. And there's some handouts here that you're going to get. Okay, glad you're here. And I still have to do it this way because I have to sort of do a little task and then sort of clean my mind and then come back to the task. And then revising is where we re-look at the ideas. So for example, when you ask me, why do you have to teach a calf to drink milk and how do you teach a calf to drink milk, you actually were getting me to revise. And I did because of your good questions. Okay? And then finally editing, and the editing is the table manners. And one of the mistakes that some people make as writers is that they think that the table manners matter at the very beginning. They don't matter. The only time the table manners matter is at the end when something is made public. And I like to think of it this way. So when I get up in the morning, it's long before my wife gets up. And the only living creature that's up before me is the cat. And when I eat breakfast, I guarantee you the cat does not care what table manners I use. Okay. So my usual thing is I have the cereal bowl in this hand, and I wander around the house maybe picking up something that was left from the night before or something like that. But it doesn't matter. But if I were to invite you over to my house, I would use good table manners because it matters. Because there's an audience at that point. There are other people in the room. And that's what you need to think about. Because if you worry too much about the table manners early in the process, it slows down production. It really impedes production. Okay. Questions about any of that? So these are some general principles about process. All right. Now, in one of the writing workshops that I do, we do some invention work on writing about a memorable family member. These are my paternal grandparents, Peter Melvin Roan and Helga Borgerson Roen. And in this invention activity, we start out this way. I would ask you to list a few family members that evoke some memories for you. And by the way, in this writing workshop, if you invite me to come do that with your group, I would insist that you write about someone that you've known in your life. Don't write about some ancestor who lived 300 years ago, because everything that's known about that ancestor is available somewhere else. But what you got up here about that person that you've interacted with, when you're gone, that material's all gone. So it's really crucial that you write about those people that you have interacted with. And then choose one of them. The principle here is that the first thing that pops into our mind is not the thing that we should be writing about. So maybe I think about my Uncle Leroy, who told a lot of funny stories. Or I think about my middle grandson, Kevin, who has autism. Or I think about my mother, who I'll mention a little bit later. And I think about a couple other family members. And then I pause for a minute and say, all right, at this moment, which family member do I feel most compelled to write about? You know what? I just read a story about autism today. I'm going to write about my grandson. Okay? And maybe next time I'll write about my mother. And then, once you decide on that person, there are just some questions to ask yourself. You know, what did that person look like? What roles did that person play in the family? What are some words or phrases? My grandma Roen, for example, spoke Norwegian when she was little, and so she would say things like "uff da" when she wanted to express some strong emotion, or she'd say "nai, nai, nai" instead of "no, no, no." So those are some phrases and words that I associate with her. And we all have those kinds of words and phrases that we associate with people. The general principle here is to generate as many details as we can, because good writing is just rich in details. And then, what kinds of activities did you do with this person? So right now, for example, I'm thinking about my Uncle Donnie, who didn't have children until later in his life, and so he would take me all sorts of places. He would take me fishing, and he would take me to the Minnesota Twins when they first came there in 1960 from being the Washington Senators. And so I have all these fond memories of things that I did with him. What did this person like to do most in life? And that tells a lot about that person, because that gives you an opportunity to talk about that person's passions. Where did you like to go with this person, or what did you like to do with this person? The single most memorable event that you associate with this person. So I think about my Uncle Donnie, and right now the image that's coming is his lying in a bed, hospital bed, at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota with brain cancer. And that's the image that I have. And that's a very powerful moment in my relationship with him. And so I might write about that. Or I might want to be a little more upbeat and write about a time he took me fishing. But, you know, when we write our family histories, we don't make choices, this or this. We write about all these things. We write about the sad things, we write about the happy things. But I do want to mention something. Usually I get asked in these workshops, what about the bad things that have happened? Okay? And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but my wife Maureen and I have been keeping a daily journal every day since October 26, 1978. And we have a little over 15,000 pages. And when we first started, we focused primarily on our two children, Nick and Hannah, and then we included lots of other things as well, and I'll mention more about that. But the one thing you will never see in that journal is a negative comment about anybody. Nobody. Okay? Now, some people will say, well, you're not giving the full picture. Well, right, but we're always editing. There are some things in anybody's lives that you wouldn't make public. Okay? And we have just chosen not to make public any negative comments that we might want to make. We tend not to make negative comments about people in general. And then, what feelings come to mind when you think of this person? You know, well, and it's going to vary. It's not a single set of feelings. You know, when you think about your uncle who took you to the baseball game, as opposed to when your uncle was on a deathbed, there are much different feelings associated with those two kinds of things. Okay. Questions about that one, a memorable family member. By the way, when I do the memorable family member workshop, inevitably a few people in the room cry. That always happens, which is a good thing. That's good. The writing is powerful when people cry. All right, invention activity. Writing about a memorable family event. This is a family reunion of the Roens from the mid-1950s. And I am the angelic one here looking skyward. Okay. So the memorable family event might be something like a family reunion. It might be a birth. It might be a death, a funeral, a wedding. Or a memorable family event could be something like a conversation that you had with your parents when you were 13 years old over dinner one night. And that conversation has stayed with you all your life. And it's something you live your life by. That's a very powerful event, although at the moment that it happened, you might have thought, this is just a dinner conversation. So think of events in those ways. I mean, what sort of effect have they had on your life? And then the same principle as before, list a few events that are memorable for you, and then pick one, and then respond to these questions. When did the event occur? Where did it occur? Who participated? How did you participate in this event? And what was your role in the event? Other questions, have your thoughts changed about this event over time? What significance of this event to you? What is the significance of this event to other family members? Right now, I'm thinking about a family event that happened about 20 years ago when a 2-year-old nephew had heart surgery and then died about a week later. And in my life, that is the most powerful event ever. Much more powerful than my mother's death, much more powerful than anything else I can remember. And so we should write about those things. So we can write, it's okay to write about grief. It's okay to write about healing. It's okay to write about how our feelings have changed over time. I'll tell you, though, when I think about his death, I still sometimes get choked up, even though it's 20 years later. And then writing about a memorable family place. So This place, for example, that's me when I was probably 3 or 4 years old. And that's the dairy barn where I spent a lot of hours every day when I was growing up. And so for me, that barn is a very memorable family place. I remember listening to, anyone from Minnesota might remember KDHL radio station out of Owatonna, Minnesota. Played schottisches and polkas and waltzes primarily. And WCCO radio, my dad would listen to them, and I remember watching my dad dance to the music sometimes while he was waiting for the milking machine to finish its job on the cows at the moment. And that barn burned down, by the way. And I was inside it when it burned down and almost didn't make it out. That is that's another powerful moment in my life. Well, actually, let me tell you a little story. It burned down in January when I was in 8th grade and in the early 1960s. And what happened was there was a heat bulb that we put on the 8N Ford tractor every night in the winter so it would start in the morning, put it on the engine block. The heat bulb had fallen off the engine, and there was some straw down below. And my dad, for some odd reason, thought something was wrong, so he asked me to go out there and check, and it had started. So I put the fire out, and then I unscrewed the light bulb, and then I put it back on the tractor, but apparently it fell back off the tractor. And then another part of the story is my younger brother, Terry, my dad called into the house. My brothers and I had finished our chores for the evening. Called my brother out to double check on my work. Well, my brother never made it out there. This was in the pole shed attached to the barn. The lighting was really poor out there. He didn't make it out there because he was afraid of the boogeyman. And of course, I think that when we were growing up, the adults always told us about the boogeyman. And I often think about how the boogeyman really was one of the causes of that barn burning down. Okay, so there are really good stories like that in our lives. So a memorable family place. So a memorable family place could be your grandparents' house, the house where you grow up, a church or a synagogue or a temple, or summer camp where you went, or a resort where you went every year. But for me, and you do the same thing, list some and then choose one. For me, this is a family place that's very memorable for me. And you all recognize this as an elementary school photo. And you'll notice the great differences in height of these children. This was a one-room country school in rural Wisconsin. I went to the school, my dad went to the school before me, and his dad went to the school before him. And so you say, well, okay, I see a little family connection there. But family, what else? Well, let me name some people for you. So we've got, it's okay for me to stand in front of here? Okay. Judy Roan, Wayne Ramberg, Eileen Ramberg, Jimmy Jewell, Helen Dunn, Duane Roan, Miss Green, Bonnie Roan, Ronald Roan, Carla Dunn, Dwayne Jensen, Christy Jensen, Carolyn St. Germain, Tommy Wang, Della Jensen, Donna Roan, Kathy Rowan, Brian Ramberg, Rodney Ramberg, Dale Roan, Terry Roan, Linda Roan, Danny Wang, who is the father-in-law of my niece now, Karen Roan, Jenny Roan, Mary St. Germain, Daryl Dunn, Gary Wang, and Ramberg, Janine Ramberg. Okay. Did you notice any names that got repeated a lot? Okay. There were a lot of Roans in that school by the time. This is when I was in 6th grade. Eileen was in 7th. She was the only 7th grader, and he was the only 8th grader in that school at the time. And Jimmy Jewell, by the way, was related to me through marriage as well. So anyway, every day was a family reunion when we went to elementary school. So that's a family place. So when you think about family places, think broadly. And then, same thing. What do you see when you look around this place? What smells do you associate with this place? So I'm thinking of eraser dust right now. And the sweeping compound that we use to sweep the wood floors in the school. What sounds do you associate it with? I can hear the bell right now in my head that the teacher would ring to call us in from recess. What family members come to mind? Well, I just told you about them. And what are some family activities or events that occurred here? Well, there were programs. There were Christmas programs, for example. And all the families, all the adults would come as well, and other family members. Feelings that you associate with this place? Well, I got a lot of feelings about the people who had spent time there with me. And what is the most memorable thing about this place for you? Well, that school was closed in the early 1960s when in the state of Wisconsin they closed down all the one-room country schools. They just got rid of them, which is a shame because I thought it was a great place to get educated. And so the thing I want to say about these questions is these are just sample questions. You know, one thing that you might want to do if you're going to write about a family member or a family place or a family event is before you start, just jot down every question you can think of. Or better yet, get a bunch of family members together and brainstorm questions and then respond to them. Oh, by the way, memorable family place. A colleague of mine who now teaches in Arkansas, every summer for the past, I think, 4 decades, their family has gone to the same place in the summer. And this last year, she asked all of her family members who have been going there, would you each please write a story about some experience you had at our summer place? Every family member except one delivered, which I thought was pretty impressive. She's a very persuasive person. And she got beautiful photos, and she showed me the writing that people did. It was just spectacular. So the other thing is, you don't have to do all this work alone. You can recruit other family members to help with this kind of thing. All right, another activity, writing a biographical or autobiographical poem. I want to point out, I want to emphasize the word autobiographical here. The most important person for you to write about is you. Because you are the world's expert on you. No one else knows as much about you as you do. And so that's why it's important to do that. That's why my wife and I have recorded those 15,000 pages of journal entries, because no one else could have done what we did. And they could have done something equally as good, but it's not the same as what we did. This is my mother, and when she was right out of high school. And I show her a picture because I'm going to show you a poem about her. So this activity has 11 lines in it. So the person's first name, several traits about this person, relationship to someone else, who loves several people or things, who feels, etc. And then the last lines, in who needs, who fears, who gives, who would like to see, resident of, and last name. And by the way, there's nothing written in stone that you have to have these 11 lines. You could cut it down to 10 or 9 or 8, or you could expand it to 30. It doesn't matter. And so here is an example. I'll read the example to you. Doris, Norwegian, Swedish, Dutch, and English in her ancestry, daughter of Walter and Lucille Bystrom Bennett, wife of Harley, who loved spending time in the country, cooking for a threshing crew, and walking for hours, who felt happiest when she was talking with friends and family, who needed a cure for a disease that robs far too many minds, who feared snakes and swimming holes. I got some stories there if you want to hear them later. Who freely gave her time to children with special needs, who wanted to see an end to suffering and pain in the world. And I know that sounds like that sounds trite, but she really felt that way. Lifelong resident of Pierce and St. Croix counties in Wisconsin, Roen. What's nice about this activity is that when you get a rough draft of those 11 lines, you're pretty close to the finish line. And it's a very common activity that's used in schools in the United States, by the way. Okay. A little bit more about daily journaling. So that's my daughter Hannah with me a few years ago. I was a few pounds lighter. And so she was the star, In the beginning, we kept 2 journals, one on Nick, one on Hannah. Now we keep 1 journal, and it's got everything in it. This morning, for example, well, I'll come back to that. Don't let me forget to tell you what I wrote this morning when I first got up. And that line, recording family history as it happens. It's really important to do this as it happens, not to wait. And the reason is memory is always partial and selective. Okay? Yeah. And so if I were to go back today and wrote about what happened yesterday, I would forget some of the details from yesterday. And so this morning, so I make sure I wouldn't forget to do it. When I was getting ready this morning, I heard about the death of Shirley Temple Black. So I ran into the bedroom and grabbed the journal, and I wrote about the death of Shirley Temple Black, so I did not forget that. As in my life, when I was a kid, Shirley Temple was a big thing. You know, she was one of my idols when I was a kid. I loved Shirley Temple and her acting. And then the purpose, and I'm going to get to some questions here in a little bit. The purpose is to let your descendants know what your daily life was like. Think about this. So you might think, oh, Duane, you're writing those journals every day. Isn't that a waste of time? But how would you like to find the journals of some ancestor who lived 300 years ago, recording the daily details of life, including what they had for dinner that day, what happened at work that day, on the farm probably, what event happened in the family? That's really priceless. That is priceless. I would love to do that. And I don't know about your experiences, but in my experiences, I've got one artifact like that, where my great-grandfather, Christensen Roen, got a letter from his uncle, Nils Olson Bronis, from Forest City, Iowa, writing about my great-grandfather's cousin, Olis Bronis, who was captured in September of 1863 at the Battle of Chickamauga and was sent to Andersonville Prison Camp, where he died on June 30th, 1864, as many other people did who were sent to Andersonville. And, most people are familiar with the conditions. They lived in little caves that they dug into the hills, and then at the bottom of these hills, was the river that they got their drinking water from. So, of course, a lot of them died from disease at Andersonville. It was horrible. But that's the only artifact like that. Now, I do have some other things, and I'll mention some of them later. There's a book about one of my 4th cousin 3 times removed that I'll mention. But it's pretty rare for us to have this. So recording our family history as it happens is really an important thing to do at any stage of our lives. And then I want to go back to that concern that someone asked later. What do you want descendants to know about your life? What do you want to censor? Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll tell you a little bit about what they look like right now. The question was, what are you going to do to preserve those journals? Well, we started writing those journals in 1978, and those of you who are old enough to remember 1978, anybody old enough to remember 1978? You know that there were no desktop computers back then. When I ran my data for my dissertation in 1981, I ran key punch cards through a card reader on a mainframe computer. And you go feed the data in at 11 at night and then come back the next morning at 8 and hope that the data was ready for you. The output was ready for you. And so we started recording in those blue lab books. The blue covers, and they've got light blue pages on the inside, or light green pages on the inside. And we just stuck in that habit. And some people have said, well, it'd be a lot more efficient if you did it digitally. But the other part of it is, I would love to see my ancestors' handwriting too. That's a part of who they were. So we're glad that we're doing it that way. But you're right, we need to digitize all of that in 2 ways. One, we need to scan all of them. And then the other thing is we need to input that. And, the voice recognition software is pretty good now. So I think we might just read it and put it in that way. That's a good question. But then the question about what do you want ancestors to know about, or descendants to know about your life, and not only descendants, but the general public, because these documents, probably could become public. So what do you want to say? Well, I mean, do you want to talk about an uncle who was arrested, for example? Well, it might depend on what he was arrested for. I was doing a workshop on writing about family members a while ago at one of the Mesa libraries, and someone said, well, my grandfather was a bootlegger. I don't know if I want to write about that. I said, no one's going to think less of you if you have a grandfather who is a bootlegger, because a lot of people were bootleggers back then. And but I think the important thing is to have conversations with family, before you talk about some of these things. All right, and here are some sample questions that sort of get at what life is like. Among your activities today, which ones are indicative of 2014? So, for example, I wrote about Shirley Temple Black's death, which occurred in 2014. When I get home tonight, I'll probably watch a little bit of the Olympics, and I'll write a little bit about the Olympics. The other day, I wrote about the 15-year-old Russian figure skater who was just amazing. How can you put your head straight up over your head, your foot straight up over your head? And so we like to record some of the history as it's occurring, so that people know that those are the things that we were paying attention to in our lives. Recently, last fall was the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination. We wrote about that in the journal. A while ago was the 1-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook shootings. We wrote about that as well. We write about birthdays, those kinds of things. Okay, what did you do today that revealed something about your personality? Well, today at work, we were telling jokes. And, or not jokes, we were telling funny stories. And I told a story about how we were trying to, as kids, capture these baby foxes that were in their den. And we tried to use water to get them out of the den, and that didn't work. So we thought, we'll smoke them out. And so what we did was, at one end, we put a little gasoline and then we lit it on fire. Well, so we thought, and I was waiting at the other end with a gunny sack to catch the baby foxes when they came out. Well, they didn't come out, but a big ball of fire did. It burned off my eyebrows and some of my hair. And so that tells a little bit about my personality. I love telling stories like that. And Kevin Ellsworth was telling stories today, too. And what happened in the world today that made you pause to think? Well, the death of Shirley Temple Black made me pause to think. Made me think back to when I was a child. It made me think about the Good Ship Lollipop song and things like that. Shaun White in the Olympics. Is anyone, spoiler alert, is it okay if I mention what happened in the Olympics today? Anyone who doesn't want me to mention? It's okay? Raise your hand if it's not okay. Okay. All right, it's okay. So Shaun White today did not win a medal. Well, Shaun White has been the name in half pipe for the last decade. And so to me, that made me pause to think, oh man, he's an old man now. Okay. What was the weather like today? And again, you think, weather, that's pretty trivial. Well, again, I would love to know what the weather was like in Modum, Buskerud, Norway on this date in 1787, let's say. I would really love to know that. What television shows did you watch today? Why did you watch them? How did they make you feel? How did they make you think? And again, those television shows are not going to be around 100 years from now, maybe not even 10 years from now. So that's another way of showing people what life was like for us. Other questions. What did your children or grandchildren do today that shows their personalities? The other day, for example, my grandson, the middle grandson with autism, his language skills are coming along. He's 6 years old now. And when he was first diagnosed at age 2, we thought, oh my, he's never going to speak. We had all these fears, of course. And the other day, I asked him to do something. He said, nope, not going to happen. I thought, you know what? His language skills are coming along just fine. What did your children or grandchildren do today that made you proud? What cognitive, social, or language development did you see in one of your children today? And my wife and I, when our children were little, we did a lot of that. We need to pause. No, okay. What did your children do today that made you reflect on your parenting? And, you know, all of us have experiences where we think, oh, what did I do wrong that caused my child to do that? What happened on this date in history? We do a lot of that. What happened in the family, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally? And by the way, you can do simple Google searches. You can do a Google search on the year 1787, and it'll tell you major world events that happened that year. You could do 1787, let's say Russia. Maybe you have ancestors from Russia. It'll tell you what went on in Russia in 1787. So Google's a really powerful tool for stuff like this. What was it like at work today? Okay. Well, in the middle of the day, we paused and we told stories. Okay. If you called a sibling or parent today, what did you talk about? If you thought about something from your childhood today, what was it and how did it make you think or feel? And if you listened, and I imagine there's some people in the room who did this today, if you listened to some oldies from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, what song made you think about your earlier years? The song that brings me back always is Van Morrison's Brown Eyed Girl. It takes me back to the 1968 Minnesota State Fair. If you thought about an ancestor today, what memories came to mind? If you emailed a family member today, what did you write? Nice thing about an email is you can just cut and paste it into your journal. If you received an email from a family member, the same thing. What did the person write? If you noticed a family photo today, what memories did it evoke? And I want to make a plug for using family photos to write history. One of the most powerful things, and Don Godfrey, who writes a lot about oral history, is in the room. He can maybe say more about this, but gather a bunch of family members around a table, dig out some old family photos, and just start talking about those photos. And turn on the recorder so that you capture what people are saying about those photos. And you know, you'll say, well, Uncle Donnie did this, and that'll get your cousin to say, well, and Uncle Donnie did that. And it really becomes a very highly generative activity to do it that way. What piece of good news did you receive today? What did you eat today? Another thing you think, well, that's trivial. Well, again, if I could find out what my ancestors ate on this date in Norway in 1787, I would be thrilled with that little piece of information. What did you wear today? What recreational activities did you do today? What book did you read today? Summarize what you read. What newspaper did you read today? What movies are popular this week? So you see these questions are getting at really giving a good sense of what life is like for you in today, in 2014. Questions, comments, objections? Yes? I did write about the Beatles, and I wrote about, this is the 50th anniversary of the Beatles coming to America, so yes, recently I've written about that, and I'll probably write some more about that. I was in 9th grade when the Beatles came to the United States, so it was a very powerful time. I saw the Beatles live at Metropolitan Stadium in the Twin Cities area. So yeah, that was a big part of life. Yes, Don. My wife and I, so the routine is this, crawl into bed, write in the journal every night. And so I always do it first, and then, not always, but sometimes she will add to what I've written. She's got a better memory than I do, so she'll remember some details about the day that I've forgotten. And then if I'm traveling, usually the journal will stay home, and if I'm traveling and she's at home, then she'll write in it. If we're both traveling, we take it with us. All handwritten. Mm-hmm. And when our children, when they were little, and so both of our handwriting, and when our children were little, we would send the journals along with them when they went to visit Grandma and Grandpa, and Grandma and Grandpa would write in the journals then. So, yes. No, just sit down and start writing. We don't discuss it in advance. We do. We need to do that. We've not been good enough about that. We've been, yeah, so preserving this, we do need to make a better effort to preserve this. We need to digitize it. And, you know, we're crossing our fingers that nothing happens in the meantime. So. As the writing what? The question is, has the writing dimmed down since then? I think that we included more details about our children. We only had one child in '78. So a lot of details focused on Nick at that point. And so now our focus has changed a lot. So now we don't talk to Nick every day. So we might not have something about him every day. We see the grandchildren 2 or 3 times a week. We see our daughter 2 or 3 times a week. So, you know, the focus has changed. But it still gives a sense of what our daily life was like, yes. Right. It, yeah, so the question is, Maureen and I have different perspectives on what happened that day. So should we both write? Well, in an ideal world, yes, we would maybe have 2 columns side by side, and we both write about all the same events during the day. But it's sort of, you know, what impressed me the most that day, what impressed Maureen most that day. And sometimes I'll write something, and Maureen will make comments on it, and she'll say, "Well, actually," things like that. Um, and so yeah, there's a little bit of that going on. And you're right. You know, in an ideal world, there would be multiple perspectives on everything. Um, all right, then some questions to generate enriching details about family history. So we've just covered 5 of the workshops that I do. Writing about family people, family events, family places, the autobiographical poem, the journal writing. But then in general, you know, we should always be thinking about questions that can enrich what we say about family history writing. This is a photo of my wife and our oldest grandson when we were watching a Diamondbacks game a couple years ago. And so some enriching details. And again, these are just samples. You could come up with hundreds of other questions that would be better than this. So who is the most interesting family member you've ever known? What made that family member so interesting? So right now I'm thinking of my Uncle Leroy. And my Uncle Leroy would tell all these stories where he would embellish beyond whatever was reasonable. And we knew he was embellishing, and that made us laugh all the more. But my favorite moment about Uncle Leroy is that one time my Uncle Leroy and his brother Richard held me down on the ground when I was about 10 years old and tickled me, which annoyed me to no end. And so I called on my dog, and I said to my dog, "Sick him! Sick him!" And my dog did sick him. And so my Uncle Leroy ran across the lawn, and there was a maple tree in the middle of the lawn with a low-hanging branch. So he grabbed that branch and then pulled himself up into the tree so that the dog wouldn't get him. Well, guess who was watching? My mother. So my mother came out of the house with a belt in hand, and normally I would have just stood there and taken what was coming me. But for some odd reason, I took off for the barnyard, and it had just rained. And in the middle of the barnyard was this pool of water, and you know what else is in there, that was about 12 feet across. And I ran into the middle of it, and I stood there. And of course, my mother wasn't going to come in and do anything. So when I got out, I got not one spanking, but 2. One for sicking the dog, and then one for running away into the barnyard. How did you meet the love of your life? Now, if you've had multiple loves of your life, you know, do you include them? So, most people had teenage romances or college romances, and they didn't work out, and now married to other people. You go back and write about those earlier romances in your life, and that's a decision that everybody needs to make. Okay. What's the funniest story in your family's history? Maybe I've just told the funniest one. I don't know about Uncle Leroy. Who's the funniest person in your family? What's the funniest thing this person ever did? What's the proudest moment in your family's history? Narrate that event. What's the saddest moment in your family's history? Narrate that event too. So, so we're getting in a spectrum here of emotional content, from things that make us happy to things that make us sad. And life is about that full spectrum. So it's important to record that. What's the greatest hardship that your family has endured? And all of us have some family stories that are like that. My wife's family, for example, came from Ireland around 1850. And we all know why they came, right? The potato famine, yes. And so they endured horrible, along with other people, horrible hardships that brought them to the United States. What was the most pivotal event that led you to your career? So right now I'm thinking about 8th grade, Joyce King, my language arts teacher. I wanted to be like her. She was such a kind, supportive person. I wanted to be like that. All my inclinations were in math and science. But those people weren't the role models that she was. So that's why I have the career in English that I have. And so we should write about those things as well. What was your favorite family vacation? Describe it. Your favorite family photo. What's the story related to that photo? Why did your grandparents live in? Well, my great-grandparents settled in western Wisconsin right after the Civil War. Why? Those of you who know a little bit about immigration history, why did they settle in western Wisconsin in 1865? That's where the land was free in 1865, yes. And if they'd come a few years later, it would have been in Minnesota. If they'd come 15 years later, they would have been in the Dakotas. Okay? And so, some of those things. And by the way, we don't need to know this information firsthand. It doesn't need to be handed down from one generation to the next. We can all read the history books, and we can find that information. So when we write our family histories, we need to enrich them with the information that we find in history books and elsewhere. Why did your ancestors come to America? What was happening in America when they came here? Another good story. Another set of my wife's ancestors came to the United States, and they arrived here, I think I've got the date right, April 14th, 1865. Well, what happened on April 14th, 1865? Lincoln was assassinated. I got the right date, right? April 14th? Yeah. Anyway, so they went into hiding. They went into hiding because they thought people were going to blame them for Lincoln's assassination, because they were foreigners. And at that point in the United States, through the last half of the 19th century, there was a lot of xenophobia, a lot of fear of anything foreign. And so they knew that. And so they hid out for a while, which, we think, well, that's really irrational. But, put yourselves in their positions and think what was going through their mind. What family tradition has been maintained the longest in your family? In my family, it's baking lefse. Lefse, anyone, any lefse eaters? Yeah, I love lefse. Those of you who haven't experienced it, it's like a flour tortilla, except it's made with potatoes. And it is so good. What's happening in the world on the day that so-and-so was born? So you can do a Google search on any date in history, and you can find out what was going on in the United States, in a particular state, in the world. What's the most memorable war story that one of your relatives told you? And most of us have some relatives who fought in World War II, for example, where there are lots of memorable stories. What's the most precious family heirloom, and what makes it so treasured? Well, to me, what makes it so treasured, there's a flower bin that we have in our front entryway. And that flower bin was made by my great-grandfather. And on one half was a big bin for flour, another half was a big bin for sugar. And this bin, by the way, is about this wide and about this high. And they always kept it full of flour and sugar. Right? That's a lot of flour and sugar, but they used a lot of flour and sugar. What's the most interesting family letter that you've ever found? What makes it so fascinating? So I told you about that letter from 1866. And by the way, if you have family letters, do everything you can to make them public so that other people can have access to those good stories. What were your parents' best parenting skills? What was your nickname as a child? And how did you get that nickname? And, I don't know about you, I had different nicknames when I was a kid. Some I liked, some I didn't like so much. But write about those things as well. What's the most interesting fictional account of some family story? So, for example, one of my grandfather's brothers, named Andrew Roan, died mysteriously out west somewhere in the late 1800s. And all we knew was that several of his brothers, went out to get his body and bring it home to Wisconsin. That's it. And the brothers never mentioned a word to their wives, ever. And so it was a big mystery. Well, a couple years ago, I finally found a newspaper, two newspaper accounts. One was on February 19th, my birthday, February 19th, 1899. Andrew Roan died Sunday night in East Grand Forks. Let me tell you a little something about East Grand Forks in 1899. Grand Forks was in North Dakota, which was a dry state. East Grand Forks was in Minnesota. East Grand Forks had a population of around 2,000 people. It had 20 saloons. Okay? So I am willing to bet that Andrew Roan died a violent death in one of those saloons on February 19, 1899. And one of the fictions is that previous to that, in the hometown newspaper in Wisconsin, it said, Andrew Roan died peacefully at his home in Pleasant Valley, Wisconsin, this last week. Okay? So there are all sorts of fictional accounts. Another fictional account. I got started doing this when I was 16 years old. And I saw the Norwegian Family Bible. And on the inside cover, it listed my great-grandparents, their birth dates, their marriage date, and the dates of birth of all their children, including my grandfather. And in their marriage date, it's 1866. Their first child was born in 1867. Well, I started doing research in the county courthouse, and I found their marriage record. They were not married in 1866. Guess what year they were married? 1867. Just 3 months before their first child was born. So another fiction, all right? And so a lot of these fictions are really, really interesting. What do census records indicate about someone's occupation? And, so we look on the census record, we find that, but then we do a little more research to find what that occupation was like back in 1880 or whenever. What were some relevant historical details about the place where so-and-so lived? And it's pretty easy to find that. You can go to local historical societies and get all sorts of details about, you may not have an account of what happened in your ancestor's life precisely, but you can find out what that place was like in those years by going to the historical society. And these days you can go on Google and find just tons of stuff. What was happening in America in such and such a year, what's happening in a specific country in that year. Okay. Then a little bit about organizing your family's history. One is a reference genealogy. And by the way, if you use something like Family Tree Maker, you simply print out what you've input into Family Tree Maker, you've got a reference genealogy. Okay? And that's a bare bones genealogy with names, dates, and places. And by the way, that's why another reason why we keep the journals. We got lots of names and dates and places for over 32,000 ancestors in our database. We don't have any stories about very many of them. Another possibility is a genealogical narrative. Excuse me. And this is an extension which includes biographical information and a little bit of information about the research methods that you use. So how did you find this information? Tell the world how you found this information. Another possibility is life story writing, and that includes things like biographies, personal memoirs, autobiographies, and in a bit I'll talk about the difference between autobiography and memoir. And then another is a well-documented, a family history narrative, and that's a well-documented family story. By the way, I mentioned Carmack there. On the last page of the handout is a list of references, and Carmack is one of the references on that list. Another possibility is a family history memoir, and this would focus on your quest to find a particular ancestor. You know, some of the popular TV shows that have been on recently, where they take some famous celebrity, and we follow them as they go on the quest to find information about their ancestors, and they have this team of genealogical researchers helping them. I wish. Edited letters and diaries. If you have diaries or letters from ancestors, edit them. And by editing, I mean don't correct the grammar and spelling and stuff like that, but put them into some sort of collection and make that collection available. Get it to the Historical Society where they live. Put it up on the web somewhere. Fictional family sagas based on truth. So, let me give you an example. If you do, and it's on the list, Simpson is the author. Simpson wrote a book. He's a fiction writer at the University of North Carolina. Simpson wrote a book about Nell Cropsey. Nell Cropsey is my fourth cousin 3 times removed. All right? Yes, fourth cousin 3 times removed. And Nell Cropsey died in Elizabeth City, North Carolina in 1900. She drowned. Her story was in every newspaper in the United States virtually, which is kind of odd because a lot of people would have drowned in 1900, but that story made it. And the mystery, and if you look at the title of the book, mystery is in the title of the book. The mystery is, how did she drown? Was it an accident? Was it murder? Or was it suicide? Well, her fiance was tried for her murder. Her fiance was convicted. The conviction was overturned. And a lynch mob almost took his life, but he did survive. And so the book, in order to write this book, which is a really interesting book, by the way, for example, in the book it describes her autopsy. Her autopsy was done out on the street with lots of people standing around watching, which is just shocking to me. But anyway, to write this book, Simpson spent lots of time researching the newspaper stories of the day, looking at genealogical records of the day, and the historical details in there are pretty accurate. And there are a lot of family members' names in the book that I recognize. And he labels it as, what's the title? The title is A Mystery of a Nonfiction Novel. A nonfiction novel. Well, novels are fictional, but this is nonfictional because he's woven all of these historical details into it. Okay. And then another possibility is a straightforward chronology for the entire family. So let's say you can get back to, if you've got Norwegian ancestors, for example, it's pretty easy to get back to the 1500s. So you start in, let's say, 1580, and you just go right up to 2014, writing it that way. Now, you know, the question is, all right, so I've got 100 family members who are alive at this 1 year. How do I handle that? So you have to deal with those kinds of questions. Another possibility is a straightforward chronology for each individual in the family. So it'd be sort of like an encyclopedia of family members. And then a collection of stories. I told you about my colleague who's now in Arkansas, where she asked each of the family members to write a story about their summer vacations, and they did that. And you know, the more you can get family members to contribute, the richer it's going to be. Going back to your question about the different perspectives. So if one person told the story of going there every summer, that's one perspective. But when you get 30 family members, now you've got this rich array of perspectives. And then a little bit about organizing chapters. One way to organize a chapter is to do it strictly chronologically, start with this date and go up to whatever date. Another possibility is thematically. A really great theme, by the way, is favorite family recipes. because every family recipe that's a favorite has lots of stories attached to it. So you maybe open the chapter with the recipe and then photos. Maybe a photo of my grandma Roan making lefse on that cast iron cook stove in the summer kitchen attached to her house. And then stories about my mother making lefse, my mother teaching me how to make lefse, making lefse today, those kinds of things. Metaphorically, maybe the metaphor is navigating rough waters. Well, that could be both literal and metaphorical. That is, when our ancestors came here, if they came in the 19th century, they came on a ship that had some rough waters. But, all of us have tragedies in our families. All of us have difficult challenges that have occurred in our family's histories. And so those are various kinds of rough waters that the family has endured. Associatively, and associatively is the easiest way. You just start writing, and whatever pops into your head, that's what you go to next, and then whatever pops into your head next, that's where you go. And for invention work, for generating ideas, that's the best way to go, I think. You can always reorganize things later. And then the question is autobiography or memoir. Autobiography is a chronological narrative that covers the writer's whole life, and some people do that, and they're wonderful, but memoirs are also popular, and memoirs usually have a focus. So a memoir might focus on a certain period of someone's life, or a memoir might focus on education, for example, the education that you experienced and how that has shaped your life, something like that. And then a little bit about using narrative techniques for sections of your family history. That's my son-in-law, who's a classical guitarist. Some narrative techniques. The easiest one is just straightforward narrative. Start at the beginning of the story and go to the end of the story. And that's a great way to tell a story. And that's how we live our lives. We live our lives in narratives. And so that's why that's such a powerful tool for telling stories. And in that, you narrate the experience from beginning to end. You relate key details surrounding the event. So, for example, when I told the story about Uncle Leroy, it's important to mention that it was a maple tree, because most people know that maple trees have different limb structures than other kinds of trees. So little details like that become important. Note the impact of the experience on your life or the lives of others who are part of that narrative. Pardon? The spanking comes in, right? Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. Spanking shaped my life. Okay. Reflect on the significance of the experience. So, what did I learn from that story that I told earlier about the spankings? Well, I was reminded that I probably shouldn't run away. Okay, when I got a spanking coming. Flashback. A flashback is just a narrative, but you start today and you think back to that event, and then you go from beginning to the end of the event. It's the same thing. It's just a different sort of starting point. Another possibility is to begin with a crisis. So the crisis, for example, might be the drowning of Nell Cropsey in 1900. And then that crisis leads to an unfolding of a bigger story about whether it was murder, suicide, or an accident. Okay. By the way, they still don't know which one it was. And you begin with the crisis point in the narrative. From there, you go back to the beginning and tell the story to the end. Relate key details from the event. And again, key details are the ones that are going to make a difference. So if I'm going to tell the story about teaching calves how to drink, it's important that I mention that the calf's neck is between my legs so it won't run away, and that I use these 3 fingers, those kinds of things. Reflect on the significance of the events. That's really important. You could just let readers figure out what the significance is, but most readers appreciate hearing an author say what the significance is. And then I've got some resources that I want to mention. I'm not going to mention all of them, but Russell Baker's book, Growing Up, is a wonderful model for those of you who want to write about your own lives. Russell Baker was a great writer himself, a great prose stylist. Another one is that Carmack book, You Can Write Your Family History. What's great about that book is it gives you lots of concrete, specific details about writing family history. So I encourage that one. The book by Nancy Conklin and Margaret Lurie, A Host of Tongues, Language Communities in the United States. That will give you some sense of what language was like, especially in the 19th century when maybe your immigrant ancestors came here. Let's see. Oh, Catherine Hobbs' book, The Elements of Autobiography and Life Narratives. That book is just jam-packed with little exercises to get people writing. It's a wonderful tool to get the creative juices flowing. Let's see. William Kane is someone who hangs out here in the Valley. Martinson's book, Growing Up in Norway, 800 to 1990. Books like that give you a good sense of what your ancestors would have experienced during those years. That covers a big span of time. By the way, not in that book, but in another book I have about Norway, they talk about Norwegian weddings in the 1700s. Norwegian wedding, anyone know about Norwegian weddings in the 1700s? Essentially, it was just one big drunken party for a whole week, and people would end up fighting each other with knives and stuff like that. It didn't sound like a whole lot of fun to me. Frank McCourt's books, Angela Ashes. So if you feel you want to tackle some of the sad stories in family history, that's a good model. I don't know if I want to go that way, but some of you may have more courage than I have. The Bland Simpson book, the Mel Crabsey book is really an interesting book. And, Jeanette Walls. She spoke here in the Valley a couple years ago. Jeanette Walls had a horrible life growing up. The family life was just awful. And she writes about that. And so if you want to write about that, those are some good models for that. And, this one, the Solveig Zempel book, In Their Own Words, Letters from Norwegian Immigrants. Again, if you have letters from ancestors in another language, you might have to hire someone to translate them for you, although with Google Translate you can do rough translations. They're not very good. But make those available to other people. That's why we do this research, is so that we can tell the world. It's not just for our own gratification. And that's the end of what I have to say. But I'm happy to answer questions or listen to comments. Yes. Well, different people do it differently. I've got one of my, the question is, where do you start your family history? You start with the day you were born. If you're writing about your autobiography, yes, that's where I would start. But if you are talking about your family writ large, in my database, for example, I've got over 32,000 ancestors. My Dutch ancestors I can trace back into the 1300s on one line, Norwegian ancestors back to the 1500s. So, you could start back that far and sort of work forward. But, my general advice is, what are you most passionate in writing about? And that's where you should start the writing, is what you're most passionate about. And the other lesson that I've learned over the years, those 15,000 pages of journal entries that we have, when I mention that to people, like, oh my word, how could you write 15,000 pages? 15 minutes a night. That's all it takes. 15 minutes a night, you get 15,000 pages. But to answer your question more directly, I think you have to decide, what kind of effort do I want to invest in this? And if I want to write about my ancestors going all the way back to the 1300s and coming up to the present, I've got thousands and thousands of people to write about. Of course, for some of those people, you've got virtually no details, so it's going to be easy. But, you probably want to write about, all right, so these ancestors came from the Netherlands and landed in Brooklyn, in what's now Brooklyn, in the 1640s. Well, what was it like in the Netherlands then? What was Brooklyn like then? Well, Brooklyn was farm country back in the 1640s. And so, you can get a lot of details from history books. The other thing is, spend a lot of time spend some time reading history books about the time periods that you want to write about, and look at how other people write about them. And you know, one thing that you can do with family histories is very liberally quote from those sources. So if you're writing about your family history in the Netherlands in the 1630s, you don't have to rewrite all of that. You can cut, some of that's on the web, you can cut and paste it. Of course, make sure you acknowledge the sources and be a good honest scholar. Yeah, so the question is, I'm repeating the question for the people who are tuned in. The question is, would it be possible to write about ancestors sort of based on how we have thought about ancestors, interacted with ancestors throughout our lives? I think that's a great way to do it. And so, you know, you talk about interacting with your grandparents, and if you're lucky, interacting with your great-grandparents, or maybe thinking about those Irish ancestors who came here in 1851, or I think it was 1851, to escape the potato famine. So yeah, you could make your life the center of this, but then from your life you reach out to all these other things. And that, I think that's a wonderful way to do it. That's great. Great idea. Yes. Uh-huh. Well, you know, it depends on, yeah, it depends on how widely you're going to distribute it. You know, those of us who work at the university, if we include any information about living people, if it's not public information, we need to get approval from the Institutional Review Board, and we also need to get informed consent from the people we're writing about. As a family historian, you don't have to do any of that. You're not associated with an institution. But what you might do is if you're writing about any things about your family that are controversial, you might want to ask family members, how do you feel about this? And then you have to make a decision. So someone objects, but let's say 10 family members say that's okay, but one family member objects. What do? So you have to make a decision. Okay. Um, does that answer? Okay. Well, yes, yeah, but absolutely. You know, these days it's using pictures is really easy. You know, back when I was a young person, if you wanted to include a photo in anything, you had to, you know, paste it onto a sheet of paper to put it in a book like this. But these days you can digitally include photos very easily, and you can position them on pages and all that. Yeah, I mean, photos are very important. Photos provide a lot of details. You know, my you're talking about a printed book. I think these days the best, one great option is to make things available digitally on the web, because you can include not only photos, but you can include audio recordings, you can include video recordings, and really make it rich. And you could make it a blog, for example. You could make it a website on Google Sites. You know, it's easy to set up a website on Google Sites, for example. Anything else? Any other comments or questions? Thank you so much for being here this evening. I really appreciate it.